Energy, and you are logged into hopefully the last meeting of the UP Energy Task Force Phase 1. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that all means in just a second. A few housekeeping reminders. So actually, Matt, why don't you run through your housekeeping reminders that you just said? Just say them again for everybody.
So the biggest thing is please mute your microphones if you're not speaking. And I think it's going to be minimal as far as showing cameras, but if you're having performance issues with your internet connection, then you're definitely going to want to shut your camera off. And there is a chat dialog box. If you wave your mouse over the screen, you can see a camera, microphone, screen, 3 dots, and then to the right of that is a little conversation box, and you can click on that. And if you have any comments or questions, please populate that area, enter your comments in there, and then Lisa can call on you directly. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you. You're muted.
I'm muted. First time. Thanks, Matt. Yeah. Everybody from Eagle knows I have to stay muted because I have a loud dog. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us. Again, my name is Lisa Clark, for those of you who don't know me. We are going to run through our agenda here for today. But I want to start off by reminding those who might be joining us more recently, all of the materials for the UP Energy Task Force exist on our website. So it's michigan.gov/UP Energy Task Force. If you're on the webinar, you should be able to see that link on the screen. Also, we've been receiving lots of public comment over this time. If you are on the phone and you want to join us for public comment today about what the task force should be doing in phase 2, you can send an email to eagle-upenergy@michigan.gov. If you're on the webinar and you want to do public comment today, feel free to put it in the chat box. And we're going to do two chunks of public comment, one at the beginning, one at the end. We are very interested in what people want the task force to be thinking about in the next phase of our work. And we've received a lot of that already through the course of the public comment on the phase 1 draft report, but certainly looking for more input there. Okay, and so with that, we are going to start. Everybody, please make sure you're muted. We're going to start by going through a roll call of task force members, because that will probably be the easiest way to do this. So I'm just going to run through the list. Senator Prusi, I think I heard you say good morning already.
Good morning. I had my camera flipped around to show you the 22 we have here, but so white you can't tell what you're looking at anyway.
Oof. That's a doozy. I got nothing for that other than I've seen the pictures on Twitter this morning and they are astonishing. Tanya Pozlowski.
I'm here. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Chris Bowman.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning, Chris. Mr. Camps.
I'm here. Good morning.
Mike Furmansky. Are you with us? Our first Mike.
Good morning.
Mike. Good morning, Mike. Second Mike. Tom Harrell. Tom, are you with us this morning? Okay. All right, Tom, feel free to chime in if you're having mute issues. Jen Hill.
Is here. Good morning.
Jen. Douglas Chester.
I am virtually present. Good morning.
Good morning. Aaron Johnson.
I'm here. Good morning.
Thanks, Aaron. Good morning. Mr. Koshivar. Jim, are you with us? All right. Jim, if you're having trouble getting off mute, feel free to chime in later too. Michael Larson. All right. No Michael, no Jim. Mike Nystrom.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Mike. Thanks for joining. Tony, are you with us?
I'm with you. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. General Rogers. All right, he's a busy guy. Commissioner Scripps.
Morning.
Morning. Roman, did I see you in the chat box?
Yes, indeed. Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Roman. Chris Schwartz, are you with us? Chris, are you here today? All right. Tanya Sweener.
I'm here.
Morning, Tanya. Thanks for joining.
Morning.
Okay, so I'm going to loop back Chris Schwartz, Michael Larson, Jim Kachiver, or Tom Harrell. Did any of the few of you have a chance to get off mute and join us? Okay, we may have some absences then. All right, great. Thank you, everybody. All right, we are going to start. Let's see. All right, we already talked about muting our mics. I want to remind everybody that we are recording, as we always do with our UP Energy Task Force proceedings. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time here, all of our previous proceedings are also recorded. So go to michigan.gov/UP Energy Task Force to find all the previous materials and proceedings for this. Okay, and so with that, okay, so our agenda in front of us, hopefully everybody has had a chance to take a look at it. It's fairly simple. We're going to take public comment at the outset, and then we're going to talk through the public comment that we've received over the course of the last 3 weeks, closing on Friday, April 6th, as they connect to the draft recommendations, and then we'll see if we have other public comments, and then we'll see if we can adjourn by noon. With that, I'd like to go ahead and adopt the agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
This is Douglas Chester. I so move.
Thank you, Douglas. Is there a second?
Tony Rachevsky.
Second.
I heard Tony. Thank you, Tony. And then all in favor? Actually, I'm sorry. Any discussion on the agenda? All right.
Lisa, just really quickly, I think
Yes.
according to the agenda, we're taking public comment at the end, not at the beginning.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I might have an old one. Okay. Any comment, any discussion on the agenda? All right. All in favor?
All
Aye.
right.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. The agenda is adopted. Thank you, everybody. Okie doke. So as with our previous work, everything's available on the website. I want to make sure you know that the draft recommendation document that we're going to talk about today we'll be using it from the webinar, so you'll be able to follow along there, but you can also go and pull it down on the website as well as the other materials. So michigan.gov/UP Energy Task Force. Okie doke. So with that, I am going to remind anybody who wants to participate in public comment, either use the chat function or send us an email at egle-upenergy@michigan.gov with your name if you'd like to comment. And then we've also are always glad to receive written comment. Let's all make sure we're muted. Everybody, please make sure you're muted.
Somebody's driven down the road, so.
Okay, so the good news about everybody muting themselves is I don't have to take over and mute you. The bad news is if we can't mute ourselves, I'm going to have to take over and mute everybody. So we'll try to avoid that because it's nice to allow you to unmute yourselves. Okay, so to get started, I just wanted to lay the foundation for the conversation that we're having here today. And take us all the way back to the executive order from last summer. So you all know how I like to do this. So the UP Energy Task Force was created by EO 2019-14, and our charge is to assess the UP's overall energy needs, how they're currently being met, formulate alternative solutions for meeting UP energy needs with a focus on security, reliability, affordability, and environmental soundness. This shall include, but is not limited to, alternative means to supply the energy sources currently used by UP residents and alternatives to those energy sources. Our third task is to identify and evaluate potential changes that could occur to energy supply and distribution in the UP, the economic, environmental, and other impacts of such change, and the alternatives for meeting the UP's energy needs in response to such changes. And of course, the first version or the first phase of the report was a focus specifically on propane needs for the Upper Peninsula. We have met a lot. We met in July for our formation in Marquette. In August, we had presentations in St. Ignace on the UP demography of energy, resiliency. We met in September in Hancock and had presentations by energy providers about propane in the Upper Peninsula. We met in October in the Sioux. We had presentations on consumer protection, energy assistance, and weatherization. We met in November in Escanaba, more presentations on customer protection, and then a great presentation by EIA on the overall propane industry outlook, which was really interesting. And then we've had a series of working sessions. So we had our first working session in December. We had a modeling in-depth discussion in January. In February, we had another working session to kind of knit together the modeling discussion with the recommendations. And then in March, about a month ago, we had a draft report that we discussed that was in front of, similar to what's in front of you here today. So here we are. I didn't count, but we're at like 12 meetings-ish. We've been trying to be in the Upper Peninsula as much as possible and to accommodate the more than 50% of Upers on our task force membership, and also to make sure that the conversation was really close to the people that it impacted. We've had a lot of public comments. So total written public comments submitted to us through the website is over 950 public comments. Of those, more than 800 were submitted between March 20th, which is when we posted the draft recommendations online, and today. Total written comments by letter were 42. We do like snail mail. That's totally acceptable. Total in-person verbal comments at our meetings from July to March were 57. So we are over 1,000 discrete public comments to date, even though we know, some of those folks came back a couple of times. We had a few repeat presentations with different content at the public meetings. We've covered a lot of material, and as usual at my opening comments, I just want to say again a huge thank you to the task force members for their tireless attention to the work that we've done. And I know this first phase has been challenging, but I certainly am also feeling daunted by the second phase as well. So I appreciate being able to do this shoulder to shoulder with all of you. So that last meeting that we had in March, you'll recall we did remotely as well. And unfortunately, I was coming and going. So on that day, that was the first day, or that was the day that we at state government received our marching orders to transition to teleworking. And so a lot's changed in the last few weeks. We also, from a COVID perspective, we were at who knows how many cases at that point, and no deaths. We're now at 24,000 cases and close to 1,500 deaths. So I wanted to give a brief update on what Eagle's been doing, because I think that it's pretty important given the world that we're in and the way things have changed. So our approach from an Eagle perspective has really been to follow the directive from the administration to freeze in place to the best of our ability. So our initial work was transitioning our team into a teleworking environment, while we're also maintaining fidelity to our mission of protecting the environment and public health. State government is critical right now, and our mission is more important than ever. So Eagle's continuing to do inspections. We're continuing to respond to reports of pollution. We're continuing to enforce laws and to enforce permit conditions that protect public health and the environment during the COVID crisis. We're constantly reviewing and tailoring and amending those processes so that we are complying with the administration's directives while ensuring that our vital work of protecting public health and the environment is rigorously pursued. For those of you that are interested in more detail, please take a look at our website, michigan.gov/EGLE, Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And on the front of our site is information about how we're responding in COVID crisis. So you can find frequently asked questions. Are our offices open? No, our district offices are not open. So you can kind of run through there and understand if our laboratory is open. Our laboratory is a skeleton crew that's shifted so that we are maintaining as much social distance as possible while still meeting our needs in order to do all the sampling and testing that's necessary to keep moving public health and the environment forward in this challenging time. So take a look at our website for more information. We know that we as an agency cannot create a problem for the state by not doing our jobs. Michiganders are counting on us to do our jobs, and so we're working to find the safest way possible to continue to do what we do every day. As I talk to our team, I've been very consistent in the last 4 weeks about our priorities. Our first priority is do everything in our power to protect our team of 1,200 people and our 10 million residents of the state. Our second priority is to effectively and efficiently execute our mission to protect the environment and public health in the context of the world that we live in. So we've been using those two goals to help us do all of our decision making over the last 4 weeks, and to make take thoughtful steps forward on how do we continue to meet our mission, but do it in a way that is really as safe as possible. So we know that our work has to continue, and a majority of our work can be done safely, and a lot of it's needed for the protection of the state. So more than 90% of our team was teleworking about 7 days after we talked last. Again, our labs have gone to shifts and increased distancing, and obviously our communication continues, not only meetings like this. We had a high water webinar just a couple of weeks ago with 900 people registered and 600 people participating. So we know that we've got to layer in lots of different ways for us all to continue to be communicating, but that we have to do that in a thoughtful way. We're working to extend any deadline that we can, but also create additional opportunities for people to participate and give comments so that we can continue to do the work that we need to do in this time. So that's my setup, but back to the work at hand. We've received a lot of comments since our last meeting, which is super helpful. So the purpose of today's meeting is to talk through the report that should be submitted by this Friday, and understand the public comment that was received since the last discussion that we had about a month ago. So we talked through a lot of substantive changes at that time, and now we've had 3 weeks of opportunity for public comment, and so we want to review that together. So with that, I'm going to take us into reviewing our public comment, unless we have any questions. I'm just going to pause there and see if there's any discussion. Task force members, you can unmute yourselves if you have anything you'd like to bring up. All right, then I'm going to think we're all largely in agreement. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the document, the draft recommendations document. So working through in order, let's start on page 4. So the first round of recommendations start with storage capacity. And thinking through the amount of storage capacity we've got in the state, and then how can we use either residential or other types of existing commercial storage to increase the amount of propane that can be available if there was the challenge of a disruption. So we've got 3 recommendations. Actually, James, do you want to talk about this? It looks like in the summary document there weren't a lot of comments on 1 and 2, but more on 3.
Yeah, I would say that's true. In general, I think people are supportive of the idea of trying to figure out if we could either better utilize our existing storage or potentially augment it. So I think the comments went from, there, of course, is already marketing that goes on today about filling your tank early and kind of getting everyone as full as possible going into the season. We also realize that, optimal use of resource by the propane retailers might not mean that everyone's full, because they want their trucks kind of moving all the time. So there would have to be an incentive program potentially crafted if you wanted them to push toward fuller tanks at any one point. There was a question on number 3, which got into the concept of a strategic reserve. The way I envisioned this was more, if the state had a strategic reserve, it would be something where they would be selling to propane retailers who were having a hard time getting product, not necessarily going, skipping to the retail customer level. It would just be something available for propane retailers to access. We could, if task force members wanted to, kind of hone that one in a little bit more on that point. But I think that's all I have on this one.
Any discussion?
This is Douglas Chester.
Please, Douglas, thanks.
Okay. All right. The Attorney General made a recommendation with respect to our draft recommendation 1 that perhaps is not as crucial as the one that James highlighted on recommendation 3, but I think is easily fixed. So my suggestion on that is, if you at present, recommendation 1 reads in the middle, program designed to encourage propane retailers to work with their customers. And if we change that to encourage propane retailers and their customers to work together, then we have, I think, appropriately responded to the Attorney General's recommendation. So I would suggest that change.
Seems reasonable. Any concerns or discussion?
Mm-hmm.
Kimber, could you reflect that in the document so we can all see it?
Can you see that I made a change?
I can't see it yet.
Okay, 1 second.
No problem. Yeah, it's just not coming through. I don't know why. Oh.
Maybe she's refreshing. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I lost the document, so I'm sure it's coming back. While Kimber's doing that, any concerns with that change? Okay. Great. Looks good. Okay, we can see it, Kimber. Perfect. Okay,
I'm not sure
go ahead.
if I need to unshare and reshare to show every change, but that's what I just did, and if it worked, I'll do that.
Okay, thank you. Can you take us back down to the other comments, and let's talk about if we need to incorporate any of the other comments into recommendations 1, 2, or 3.
You can't see the document here, Lisa.
Oh, you're having trouble seeing it? Okay,
Yeah.
so we're at the bottom of page 4.
Okay, there we
So,
go.
okay.
Okay, got it.
All right, so Douglas's comment was on the first piece of the Attorney General's recommendation. The second recommendation asks for examples. I think that's also a sound point, but I'm not sure that we've got, I'm not sure that we are in the position to flesh out examples at this time, unless others have thoughts on that.
This is Douglas again. I could suggest several, but I'm concerned that doing so would then limit the scope of future discussion of the recommendation. So I'm inclined to keep it general and see if we can't work toward policy coming to a specific recommendation or a solution in the future.
Yeah, I agree with that. Does anyone have concerns? Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think that makes more sense. And then the third discussion point is intriguing. This recommendation should be clarified.
Yeah, this is
Okay.
Dave Chance.
I feel, oh, yep, please go, Dave.
Okay, sorry.
You're fine.
The storage we have is pretty much more of a holding tanks that we saw like at the retail level down in Rapid River. And this recommendation here would really could buy us some time. And throughout the report, it talked about how we can take advantage of delivery protocol to enhance the pricing of propane by getting some delivered more in the summer than in the winter on the 2-to-1 deliveries that we see later in the report. I'm just wondering if this, how much storage, whether underground or above ground, would we need to capitalize on that even further instead of 2-to-1, say the 3-to-1, or maybe even possibly getting all the propane at low price times of the year to maybe potentially reduce the cost of propane while we do this. That's one of my thoughts I had on recommendation 3. And then I looked into storage a little bit, and there's some storage available in the Michigan Basin in the northern part of the lower peninsula. They have salt deposits there, and up here we have sandstone deposits that may have the potential for storage of NGLs or propane. And we happen to have a college up here that has a number of geologists and departments that look into that type of thing. There may be possibilities in underground storage. Would a follow-up to get more detail on this recommendation be some kind of initial look at this and see if it's even a possibility to do underground storage?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, to me, what that says, Dave, is in line with both comments from the Attorney General as well as from the Michigan Propane Gas Association. These are high-level recommendations. There's a lot more research that would need to be done in order to take these things to fruition, but I think they're an important starting point. And so, you're calling on, what's the additional geology work? There's certainly some additional economics work and other pieces that need to happen, which is what I see pulled out in the AG's comments on number 3, and then also the MPGA's comments on both 2 and 3. So my thought would be, and you all can, tell me if you want to go in a different direction. My thought would be, I think these are really good comments. I'm not sure that we have the ability as a task force to go in greater depth. But I see these as being important components of what would be a next step. So I think in my mind, we've hit it from a high level at the starting point, and then these are really important next steps to drill down.
Okay.
Other thoughts?
Liesl, this is Dan Scripps. I think James spoke on this a little at the beginning, but my understanding was the idea of a strategic reserve was in some ways more like a contracted reserve or a virtual reserve than actual molecules physically stored in some place. In that we would potentially use the state's buying power to purchase, and then the question of sort of where it actually, then we have the right to it when we need it to assist retailers, is I think how James talked about it. And then the question of where it ultimately gets stored is up to the wholesale suppliers with whom we might have the contract. It's just that when we need it and when our retailers need it, we would have a claim to it. So I think we should maybe either try and clarify that a bit more, or potentially drop it into the contracting section. That's, I think, recommendation 13 later in the document, where it talks about the other way that we are thinking about using the state's purchasing power. If that, James, is not what you intend here, and I'm misunderstanding that, I'm happy to be corrected. But I think some of the question on this, not all of it, but some of the question is sort of where would it be stored? And in some ways, I think that is sort of ancillary to the thrust of the recommendation, that we have a claim on it when we need it.
Yeah, this is James. Dan, I think you raised a good point in that it might be one of these things where if the state thought this was a good idea, it could put out a request for bids and see, kind of what the wholesale market came back with, as far as the different ways this could be constructed. So there's probably something to be said for not trying to think that we know the answer here as far as how that might work. The later recommendation was just kind of reaffirming that there was a couple of different places we talked about the state's role, and it was meant to encompass kind of the ones that had occurred before. So again, I don't know if more detail is needed, but I'll leave that to the task force.
So what do folks think? Does it make, should there be more fleshing out of this recommendation 3 here to indicate that it would be, I mean, it says it would be a contract, but to more clearly indicate that this is not a literal reserve. Yeah, I'm gonna stop talking and see what other people think.
No.
Liesl did camps here. Yeah, I think we need to push on this a little bit more, just even per the AG's questions, just to get a little bit more definition. I don't know how fast we would have to turn things on, but if it's a virtual contract or if there's no molecules stored anywhere, that could really delay the process of getting propane. So yeah, I think this probably would need to be drilled down a little bit in the detail section, even approach whether it's feasible or not, and from both sides, whether it's a contract or molecule storage or not.
Okay.
I
Mike?
firmly believe that recommendations need to be generalized. I think the more detail we put in recommendations, the more this report bogs down. We can give details in the narrative of these of our report, but our recommendations should be very general.
This is Douglas. I can agree with Mike that it would be useful to incorporate the content of these recommendations from MPGA and the Attorney General in the narrative below this recommendation. I am a little concerned on one point. If we view this as a virtual reserve rather than a physical reserve, then we need to think about how it serves as an assurance of security and affordability of supply. And I think that can be done. An interesting approach would be that, any contract that assures for such a reserve requires deliverability even under difficult conditions and at a pre-established cost. And then I think what we would see in the marketplace is that anyone offering to provide that reserve would either provide storage or incorporate the risks of having to supply transportation at high cost in the event of a disruption of supply. So I think as we approach this, we should focus on the result of it being a reserve that is deliverable in the event of a disruption of normal supply. And then we can remain open as to the specifics of how that is done and use the comments from MPGA and the Attorney General to provide that rationale in the narrative below the recommendation.
So if we go back up to the recommendation itself, it says in a manner that would create the equivalent of a strategic propane reserve to be used in case of a disruption.
Right.
Is that kind of what we're saying here?
It is. And just perhaps adding, instead of to be used, put it as that can and will be delivered in case of a disruption.
So Kimber, could you go up to the recommendation? And Douglas, can you offer that language again so Kimber can try to put it in there so we can all look at it?
Yeah, my recommendation would be in the last part of the sentence where it says propane reserve to be used in case of a disruption. Make that read propane reserve that can and will be delivered in case of a disruption.
How about to be accessed in case of a disruption? Does that get to your access question?
Perhaps.
Oh, Kimber, we can see it. I don't know if you had to refresh or not, but I can see it.
I didn't. I just had to save, so that's good.
Okay.
So is
So
this right, or did James suggest another?
I guess that looks right to me. The other question I was gonna say is there any reason to say either virtual or, like, I agree with Mike Nystrom. I think less specificity is better. I think these are recommendations, and I think that they can be really well informed by experts as they're carried forward, and that we keep it to the higher level, so that the structure is there to play out. So, but my question is, should there be more? Do we need anything around, like, either a virtual or physical? Actually, maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure if it makes sense to even add any language there or not.
I worry about the current language making it sound like it's going to be virtual and won't potentially be something that's already kind of, stored on site, that
Okay.
it leans that way with the verbiage that was changed.
So maybe leaving it broader is better. Do people feel like this addresses the comments in an appropriate way?
That has or will be delivered in case of a disruption?
To respond to the concern James raised, I think maybe delivered is the word that's a problem. Maybe it may be available. That answer resolve it, James?
Oh, I see what you're saying, Douglas. Yeah.
Yeah, and it
So
will be
Kimber,
available.
can you change delivered to available?
I changed it and saved, so hopefully you'll see the change.
It'll be here soon. And then I guess my other question would be if folks feel like there's more to be included from, oh, I got the update. Thanks, Kimber. If folks feel like there's more to be included from
Not good.
we got a lot of really good
Meeting
comments, and
crashed.
so just figuring out how to pull things in.
Whose fault is that?
Oh, I see one comment in the,
Before I go out there.
okay, let's see. All right, making sure we've got everything incorporated. All right, other thoughts on incorporating comments from the MPGA? I think we talked through, I think we got most of the AG's comments that people wanted to speak up for. Does anybody want to speak up for more in the MPGA comments on recommendation 2 or 3? I think there's important questions being raised, and I think back to Mike's point, the goal here isn't to answer all these questions. The goal is to create a framework for these recommendations so that they can then be taken further. But I want to make sure we've captured everything everybody wants to capture.
Liesl, this is Douglas again. There is a comment in the chat box that I think warrants consideration, which would be inserting timely before the word available in the recommendation.
Yep, I think that makes a lot of sense. Does anybody have a problem with adding timely availability? Okay, seeing no concerns, let's go ahead and add that, Kimber.
It's added.
Great. Other comments on recommendations 2 or 3, either based on the comments that are in front of us or anything else task force members specifically want to bring up? Okay, let's keep moving, and folks can bring us back here if they need to in the future. So the next section is around supply infrastructure. Again, we went through this in detail in our last meeting, but let's look specifically at recommendations 4 and 5. We got comments from MDOT and some proposed language on 5, and then comments from the AG and from Michigan Propane Gas Association. Let's take 4 first. So on 4, the recommendation was around the Freight Economics Development Program to determine if any program revisions are needed for greater capacity. And on recommendation 4, the AG liked it and says it's a sound and particularly important recommendation. The AG's recommendations suggest a little bit more refinement, in particular calling out targeted to enhanced rail infrastructure key locations in the UP. So I guess, again, I'm sort of the mind that broader recommendations are better because it encompasses more, but open to discussion. Is there any changes to the recommendation 4 that any task force members would like to recommend?
This is James. I can jump in really quickly and just say there was a number of comments. There's just a couple, of course, in the document, but a number of them tried to get into more specifics on this one. A lot of comments talked about the spur to Rapid River. A lot of them talked about the need for an unloading station, especially in the western UP. So we got a fair number, all of them kind of affirming the recommendation, but trying to go more specific in general.
Great, thanks for the additional perspective. Does any task force member want to go deeper on recommendation 4?
This is Douglas. I'm in favor of staying fairly general on the recommendation, keeping a number of options open. But I do think that the Attorney General's recommendation raises one thing that we should consider. It is not explicit or clear in our recommendation as drafted that this is something that ought to be done sooner rather than later in order to provide an alternative that would be at the ready in the event of a disruption of existing delivery methods. And I'm thinking that perhaps adding a sentence to the recommendation along those lines would be appropriate. Rather than trying to word that before discussion, I'll leave it for reaction. Then we can try to wordsmith it if appropriate.
Great. How do people feel about adding a sentence around urgency to recommendation 4?
This is Roman. I'm in full support of this addition.
Thanks, Roman.
This is Dave Camps. I am too. I think a rail spur would be a good thing.
Okay, we got a couple of supports, so I'm going to switch the request. Any task force members feel like we should not add urgency language to recommendation 4? Okay, Douglas, do you want to give Kimber some language?
Perhaps something like, because of the lead time necessary to expand rail infrastructure, action on this recommendation should be undertaken as soon as is practicable.
Kimber, it's updating slowly for me. Do you feel like you have what you need?
Yes, it's in there now.
Okay.
So it should show up for you guys. It's
Great.
just right
It's
at the
coming
end.
slowly. Thank you.
Okay.
Anybody got concerns with that additional language? All right, moving on to 5. James, do you want to talk about 5? There's lots of input here.
Yeah, I think the most important part was the input from the Michigan Department of Transportation. And again, in general, they're just trying to clarify their role versus, the role of the actual rail companies. Trying to push the responsibility from making the recommendation kind of off of them and onto the rail lines themselves. I think they, as opposed to the roads where they control, most everything. I think when it comes to rail, they think that they're really kind of just somebody who tries to facilitate what the rail companies are trying to do based on markets. So their language, I think, kind of reflects that to a certain standpoint, especially as it gets into the last part of it that says, have them come forward with those spur lines that they think they currently have that might be able to be used kind of without having to build additional infrastructure. I thought was a good idea.
All right, I'm just going to read that in case people can't see it. And Aaron, I'm going to ask you in a second if you want to add additional comments. So the proposed recommendation revised by MDOT, the railroad companies should review ratings classifications of their respective ownership and, if necessary, make a recommendation to the legislature about needed rail line upgrades to facilitate propane distribution. In addition, the railroad companies that own their own spur lines located in the UP should inventory them to determine if some of these could be used to park propane rail cars in the case of an energy emergency. So that's the offered language from MDOT. Aaron, are you interested in giving any more color to that?
Thank you. Yeah, James, I think it was, that just summarized pretty well what the main change was, is that the Department of Transportation does not have the responsibility of rating the tracks, so the railroad owners are responsible for doing that, and based on they do that based on Federal Railroad Agency regulations, FRA. So that was really just trying to remove the department from that obligation to do that, because the department doesn't have the responsibility or the staff or even the training to do that. It's really a local ownership responsibility to do that.
This is Douglas Jester. I understand the point about the allocation of responsibility to the railroad companies, but I have some difficulty with a recommendation that says they should do something without saying that anyone in government should ask them to do it. No reason they should spontaneously do these things. So I would consider, the changes that you've proposed, except that I think the recommendation needs to say that somebody should ask them, and it seems to me that somebody should be the Department of Transportation.
I'm going to agree with I'm going to agree with Douglas here, because I think that it's weird for us to have a recommendation that requires the railroad companies to do something. I mean, there's a couple of ways we could frame this. MDOT could ask the railroad companies. MDOT could do a survey of railroad companies. We could recommend that the legislature, ask for this. I guess I'd prefer to do it in a way that puts MDOT kind of in the leadership capacity. So I think there's a way to frame that. Maybe it's something like MDOT should, I guess I go back to this survey concept, right? So this is something that, a lot of agencies engage in. And if the railroad companies are in a particular situation where, they want to see a build out, they're going to be inclined to respond and participate too.
Yeah, this is James. It seems like the second sentence recommended by MDOT definitely makes sense and maybe kind of better framed than our second sentence. So I would include that. But maybe it's just a modification to our first sentence that makes it a little broader. Sorry, I'm flipping between documents here. So it would read that the Department of Transportation should review the ratings and maybe ratings and recommendations of Michigan Rail Lines provided by the rail carriers about needed upgrades. And instead of MDOT doing that inventory, the rail companies are doing the inventory. So maybe it's an order issue, but the rail companies do the inventory, look at the ratings, they provide it to the Michigan Department of Transportation, who reviews all of that information and makes any recommendation back to the legislature. Does that conceptually make sense?
Yeah, I think we can draft something that works there.
So our goal will be to come up with a wording that the actual rating is done by the railroad companies, but the Department of Transportation or state government somehow requests them to do so for this intended purpose, to meet the intent of what we're trying to accomplish here. So somebody, like you say, somebody's got to ask them or require them to do that. I just don't know offhand exactly how to word that.
This is Roman. Something maybe along the lines of MDOT should investigate pathways or mechanisms, or something maybe together with, and basically convey that there is a responsibility to at least initiate the process, and we can phrase it as investigate pathways or mechanisms for ratings of Michigan rail lines and whatnot.
Let me suggest maybe we could work on this a little bit offline, go on to other ones. We'll get some language back before you, maybe by the time we get to the bottom of the document.
That sounds great, James. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to set aside 5 for the moment. Looking forward to...
Actually, I'm sorry.
Oh, wait. No, we're not done with 5. Yeah, go ahead. I forgot.
Sorry,
This is all 5.
Chris.
Go ahead.
I think the second piece of it, too, had been flagged by the Propane Association, and I want to highlight their concerns because I think they are worth at least discussing, regardless of whether it's MDOT or industry that inventories. The last sentence in the association's comment was that they believe parking propane rail cars at rail spurs would serve to increase supply concerns as it would reduce the number of rail cars available to transport propane. I think our concern is that we want the propane, and if we have to store it in rail cars, we have to store it in rail cars. But I think that they raise a good point that if everybody did this, there would be fewer rail cars to move the propane around in a state of emergency. I'm probably not as well qualified as others on this call to speak to that concern, but I don't know, without putting Chris on the spot or others, if there are folks who want to speak to this, because it seemed like a valid concern.
All right, discussion about using rail cars and parking them as storage during energy emergency.
Sorry, was that for Chris? I was in the middle of unmuting my phone.
It didn't have to be for Chris, but you probably have the most knowledge on this one. Sorry, go ahead.
I believe, the recommendation from the MPGA, I think, is, that's an obvious concern because there's only a limited amount of rail cars. And in the event of an emergency for one, unless you have somebody at the state that can, is a fortune teller, these cars aren't going to be available within a few days to just store in one location. It's quite obvious that our industry has evolved, and I think the solution to all this is to look at how the system is currently functioning. I guess those are my thoughts.
So Chris, Dan, are you both feeling like that language about car parking should come out of that recommendation 5? And just leave it
Yes,
at,
I think-
we should develop spur lines.
Yeah, I think you should just kind of leave it as an availability to bring cars in to be offloaded, not a recommendation to store a bunch of propane cars on a siding and you know, further create problems, you know, for the industry if there was a shortage.
Yep, that makes sense to me. Does anyone have concerns about adopting that change?
Well, again, this is James, just really quickly. I think we get into our head that certain disruptions are very broad-based, therefore, oh, there's a broad-based need for these railroad cars. In theory, a disruption could be very localized, and therefore railroad cars could be available. But I think I totally recognize this idea that, hey, it's a commodity. A railroad car is a commodity, which would be at a premium during those times, and that needs to be recognized. That this is probably isn't the best thing to be relying on, but in a very short-term localized disruption might be an available one. But so again, it seems like knowing where those spur lines were makes sense, being ready, but also recognizing that it probably isn't going to be very helpful in the case of a very broad disruption across the region.
Okay, so it seems like we leave the language about inventory in the spur lines and obviously work through the language of how are we collecting the rating information, but then leave the language about inventorying, but strike the language about parking propane cars, knowing that that's something that absolutely can happen when appropriate. It just doesn't end up in here as a recommendation. Does that sound right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think
Okay.
that's better.
Anybody got a problem with that now? Sounds like we've got general agreement.
This is Aaron. I think that's a good idea. We'll still look to inventory the capability and locations and how they're rated of the spur lines, but it doesn't get into directing storage on them or anything like that.
Right, and then if users want to, you know, make the economic decision that it's worth it to them to do it in that way, they can. So there's no, you know, no reason people can't, right? We're just not articulating that. Okay. Any other change? Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Douglas.
Yeah, I just have a question for those more knowledgeable on this. In the event that we had this hypothetical energy emergency and we're trying to take rail delivery and use these spur lines, do we need anything in particular to be able to offload in those locations? Or is this a matter of them relocating them to some existing facility to offload them and put the propane on delivery trucks?
It would be possible. It wouldn't be cost effective and or ideal, but you can compress liquid out of a rail car directly into a truck, you know, without a whole lot of investment. But like I said, it would be slow and arduous, and it wouldn't be, you know, it wouldn't be a good solution. But I mean, you should have a spur next to a storage facility with the proper equipment to do it in a timely fashion.
Thank you.
Any other comments on 5? And I'm going to keep us rolling if we can. All right, we'll come back to how we built the language about the recommendation in there. So moving on to monitoring of market conditions and potential disruptions. Here's an MPSC recommendation. It doesn't look like we have any comments on that to discuss. I think we may have gotten comments on that, but let's see if I've got anything else there. Anybody have thoughts on recommendation 6? All right, then taking us into recommendation, I was looking at my notes, taking us into recommendations around assistance programs. So 7 and 8, you'll notice in the document that there's some improvements from the language that we had originally drafted. DHHS was able to help us refine and make sure that it's very accurate. So taking us forward to recommendation 7, DHHS has some comments in here and some improvements. So I'm just going to read the revised. Actually, James, why don't I hand it over to you just to see if there's anything you want to pull out other than what's in the recommendation in the language from DHHS.
I can do that. As I put my rail aside here.
Oh, sorry. Put your rail aside. I can do 7 if you want to do rail.
No, it's good. I think, especially in number 7, obviously what we kind of missed here, and we talked about it a little bit, but I think they want us to highlight, is that there's 2 programs going on simultaneously. They do have a program which works all the time to get families to be self-sufficient in being able to handle their utility needs. So a lot of it is around making their house more efficient, things like that, getting the refrigerators, reduce their bills to a point where they can afford to pay them. And they also push to get them on budget plans that are offered by the propane retailer. So there's always a lot of work going on in that area. They've also got the backup kind of safety net of the SER program for those families in crisis who, just, hey, their tank is empty, they don't have the money, fill the tank up. So the edits here are really just seeing, hey, can we put a little bit more emphasis on trying to get them into the budget plans and the self-sufficiency programs, hopefully so we don't have to rely on the other program quite as much. But recognizing that it's never going to disappear, it's just a matter of balance of funding between the 2 of them.
So I'm going to assume this is a friendly amendment and everybody would feel comfortable with these changes. So any thoughts on recommendation 7 before we move on to 8? Okay, taking us on to recommendation 8. James, do you want to talk about it or you want me to?
I can do this one. This is one where I thought the comments from the Michigan Propane Gas Association were helpful in that, this is not a new idea. That the association and the state over the years has tried to look at different ways to provide the assistance. They've come to one solution today, but it's not the only solution they've used in the past. Again, one thing I thought of the Michigan Propane Gas Association, I did not assume the state would be necessarily kind of directly filling the tanks. In my head, I had a little bit more that the state would be having to enter into contracts with the various propane retailers in a way that it was just kind of it would be a customer of those retailers, and the retailer would still be the one responsible for filling up the tank. So I think there's ways you do this right, ways you could do that wrong. And I don't know if Chris wants to kind of highlight that a little bit more.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Chris, did you have any thoughts about? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Trying to give you time to get off mute there.
Yeah, no, the only concern was that whether the state does a contract with whom or whomever, but it's open to all retailers, not just one company that they bid on. It should be open to everybody.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. It would want to follow fair bidding practices.
Yeah, I think that's about it.
So James, to your point about clarification, since the way the comments came in made it seem like it wasn't as, maybe we didn't flesh this one out as much. Should we add a sentence into this to make it, to create some more clarity?
Yeah, I think we need to. So again, if we want to put this on our list of ones that
Loop
we'll
back.
draft a sentence and look back on.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Douglas. Is the intent here exclusively for use under the SER, or is it thinking that there's some broader audience for application of the delivery of state contracted gas to residents?
I was thinking primarily SER when it was crafted.
Should we say that?
We should at least reference it, I would say. That's, maybe we'll say it, give it a such as or something like that, just because these programs continue to change, but I'll try to work that into a suggested language.
Okay, so we'll loop back to 8.
Hey, it's Chris Bowman again. It's just
Sure, go ahead, Chris.
I think maybe just could we put something in there? I mean, you don't want to take the choice away from the customer on choosing whom their provider is. Whether they're getting, depending on no matter where they're getting their funding from. Just so that the end user ultimately has the choice to choose who's delivering their propane or whatever. That's all.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to work that in. And Tanya made a comment in the chat box to suggest the SIR or the MEEP program. Tanya, can you talk about that? Did you mean to pay for the contract?
I was thinking more along the line of the prices. If the MEEP program grantees could also secure a price similar to the SER payment, where I was coming.
Okay, sorry, I'm toggling back and forth between windows to make sure that I've got the.
Well, one is a federal program and one is a state program, but
okay.
If we're going to add SER, maybe we could also include the MEEP be included, because we are working on a work group to try to create an affordable payment plan with the propane providers right now through MEEP.
Okay, so reference both SER and MEEP there, or are we adding? I mean, should we? I don't hate to go backwards, but should we be adding MEEP to the recommendation 7? Maybe not. Maybe I'm not following. Oh, I see what you're saying. So are you saying in the recommendation for 8, or are you saying in the verbiage for 8?
Well, someone had suggested that we use the SER, state emergency relief, specifically in this recommendation 8.
Okay.
And I just wanted to say that I think if you're going to do that, then also include MEEP, because we work together. They get their first assist from SER and then they come through MEEP.
Okay.
So if there's contracts in place, it would make sense to include both.
Okay.
So I've got some language here, I think. A little read through it, but then we go on to other ones. But right now I just have reading the entire recommendation 8. The Department of Technology Management budget should work with DHS to determine adding a clause in its implementation of assistance programs, comma, if the state could contract for propane in a way, kind of reading the same as it does all the way to the end, adding a sentence in in implementing this recommendation, the state should recognize and work within existing contractual arrangements of the customers.
This is Douglas. That answers my concern. It moves away from an open residence to those who are assisted, which was what I thought needed to be clear.
Okay, and then is there a reference here to using SER or MEEP dollars? I'm just trying to tie in Tanya's point.
Well, that was in the implementation of assistance programs. So
Okay,
that would
great.
be both
Okay.
MEEP and SER.
Sounds good.
I agree.
Okay.
I'll forward this on to Kimber.
Sentence. I've got, in implementing this recommendation, the state should
recognize and work within existing contractual arrangements of the customer.
Contractual what of the customer?
Contractual arrangements of the customer.
Okay, thanks.
We'll reserve our right to, proofread and edit as needed.
Definitely. Typos will be cleaned.
Hey.
Okay. Somebody trying to.
Just getting flooded with email. Oh, call from user. Welcome break.
Hey, Marty Fatante, you want to mute?
Oh, that's no good.
Marty. All right. Did he hear me? Oh, he muted. Okay, great. All right, carry on. All right, we are on recommendation 9. It looks like general support for this recommendation. Certainly from the Propane Gas Association, some clarification from DHHS and also from MPGA. So DHHS is saying they're unclear if this is additional LIHEAP or GF for WAP. Yeah, we want to definitely specifically say we want to increase LIHEAP towards weatherization. I completely agree with that. I think that's a good point. Does anyone have a problem with that? It's more of a, ongoing kind of budget issues in Lansing. It'd be good to be using restricted revenue. Is LIHEAP federal too?
LIHEAP is federal, but it comes to the state, and the state gets to make a determination of how much gets put toward assistance and how much goes toward weatherization. And as they point out, we have always been a little bit low on the weatherization side as compared to other states.
Everybody okay with that recommendation or with changing that to be more clear?
This is Douglas. I support making that change.
Okay. Anybody got a problem? Disagree with that? All right. And then I'm looking through the MPGA comments as well, support for this also. And then they're making some suggestions about using the energy efficiency or EO payments on electricity. I think that that could be a point of discussion in the work group too. So, all right. Any other changes to recommendation 9? Any other discussion? All right, moving forward, recommendation 10. All right, legislature should engage MPGA about the potential of levying a small surcharge of propane fuel to target an energy waste reduction program in Michigan focused on propane users. This program could be operated in a manner similar to the state's energy waste reduction program administrator for those utilities that choose not to run their own program. So we've got some support, and I know this is, again, I'll just share with everybody, the compilation of comments here is, just intended to be a summation of everything that we received, because we received a lot. But there was concern from MPGA that there's already payments made on fuel and wanting to keep it as affordable as possible. And so MPGA is saying that they prefer additional federal dollars being appropriated to support with weatherization. So Any discussion on this one?
This is Douglas Jester. I think that the report should acknowledge MPJ's opposition to the recommendation, but I would like to keep it. The federal programs are, not likely to provide what's needed over the long haul, and we have seen fit in state policy to have surcharges on other heating fuels in order to then fund programs like this. And I think it's still a legitimate recommendation.
This is Dave Camps. I agree.
I third Douglas's suggestion.
Okay. All right, any
This-
concerns
this-
with leaving it with the revisions?
This is Dan.
Hey.
My strong sense is that the MPGA sort of can make their own case on this. The only reason I'm speaking up is because part of MPGA's argument was around connecting it to electricity bills like we do with the BEAT program. And there are some challenges with, I think that we could use the MEAT program for assistance and then have some flexibility on efficiency. But if the idea here is that we're going to create an energy efficiency fund funded by electric bills, I think we're going to get into some issues around fuel switching. And I would encourage us I would be opposed to that at this point.
So it sounds like there's general support for leaving the recommendation where it's at. I guess I would just reinforce that it is, I think, as I've said to this group a few times, we have no power. We're making recommendations to the administration of the legislature, right? And I think, that being said, the task force is just recommending that the legislature talk about what a program might look like. But I also understand. I want to be sensitive to people's concerns. All right. Any other comments on recommendation 10? All right. Recommendation 11. Legislature should establish a fund designated to pay for weatherization program deferral, home repair, and mitigation measures needed to make a residents eligible for federal, state, and utility sponsored weatherization assistance when utility sponsored weatherization assistance includes the major measure of air sealing and/or insulation. So improvements coming from our friends at DHHS, trying to allow the dollars to go further. James, do you have other comments on this one? Oh, Tanya. Many households are not able to use weatherization because not all electric utilities participate in MEAP. Yeah, and then this also gets to the concerns that we heard in the SUE from the overview of these programs and the challenges that can happen when customers are trying to make improvements. But Tanya, do you want to add anything else?
That was meant for recommendation 10. I just wanted to show my support for recommendation 10.
Oh, great. Thanks. Sorry. Other thoughts on 11?
Yeah, this is James. I think I'm here. Yeah, the clarification from DHHS says that their weatherization programs are very broad, and therefore they didn't want to see necessarily deferrals happening on homes. That the work to get them past the deferral wasn't related to the work that they had scheduled to go on in the home, and that's why they suggested that language to tighten it up to be those cases where you're really getting into kind of, instead of just replacing a refrigerator, I'll give you a new roof at the same time, that it was kind of more tied into kind of holistic whole house insulation type situations.
Sounds good. Any concerns with those changes? Okay, so that's 12. Okay, so that's the end of that section on assistance programs. continuing to move forward. We're making good time, folks. State contracting for propane, recommendation 13. DTMB should explore whether it can revise its method by which it contracts for propane to potentially go beyond just serving state supply at state facilities and provide other benefits associated with added storage or serving low-income residents eligible for bill payment assistance as discussed in other portions of this report. This, of course, ties back to, in some ways, the storage discussion from earlier. So, James, you want to talk about this? It seems like you've highlighted the MPGA opposition.
Sorry, multitasking. We're on 12 here?
Yes. No, we're on 13.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm flipping back and forth. We're on 13. So DTMB's, we've got the recommendation for bigger contract purchasing. And it looks like we've got opposition from MPGA, and then I don't know in terms of the other comments we received if there was anything else, any other comment based in opposition.
I think this was the only one that I remember coming in on this point. And again, and I think if you look at MPGA's, I think they're probably much more concerned about how this would, happen, and that the fact that it's kind of pretty wide open here. With the fix that we made earlier about trying to work through a customer's retailer, maybe that diminishes this a little bit, and making sure that we're not kind of trying to upend the market and push everyone to a specific retailer. So I think this one really was, I think, a catch-all. We ended after we'd made a couple of different references to MTMB and contracting in other places in the report. We just thought that we should have one recommendation that just kind of directed them to do something in this space and referring back to the earlier recommendations.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have that language about low income residents too, because this is not intended, if I understand it correctly, to be like an overall bulk purchase for the entire state. It's intended to, figure out how to help customers, low income residents who might end up purchasing at, extremely high times, like try to figure out a way to kind of level out that cost.
And maybe we could just add some language in here that says, consistent with the other recommendations or something like that, which shows that we're trying to tie back to some of the other things we've already talked about.
What do folks think?
This is Douglas. I'd be comfortable with James' recommendation to make a reference to consistent with other recommendations. I will say that I am not particularly persuaded by MPGA's position on this. Propane retailer ownership of tanks and the right to fill doesn't necessarily reduce the cost to customers, and it's in the short term definitely doesn't provide customer choice. And when the state of Michigan is providing public assistance, there's every reason to think about keeping that cost as low as possible for those customers. So I don't want to necessarily subscribe to a reinforcement of the current system, but I do think we have to acknowledge that it's there, which I think the other recommendation did.
All right. Other thoughts on recommendation 13? All right. Well, given that input, I think we largely leave it stand unless anyone's got concerns. Any task force members have concerns with that change or with the overall recommendation? All right, moving on to 14. So this is the customer protection component, and you all remember the presentations from the Attorney General a couple of times, or from the Office of the Attorney General a couple of times. James, do you want to talk about kind of the nuance of, what we offered versus the comments from the Attorney General?
I can. And she references the legislation that has been introduced, actually since they did the presentation to the task force, which pretty well mimics kind of what she presented to the task force. That legislation was very broad in nature. It would have included propane, gasoline, kind of any fuel, I believe. And it was kind of very kind of broad some of its definitions. I think it, like anything else, it's kind of a direct legislative proposal. It probably had a lot of things in here which we thought, oh, some task force members would probably not want to see things that way. It got into a lot more detail. The reason we initially put the Wisconsin statute in as a model into ours is that it was more focused, that basically said that, hey, during an emergency, declared by, the governor, although there's nothing to be said, it could be, declared by the governor or the legislature or something like that, that basically the propane industry would at least would have to show that even though the prices went up, it was just because, hey, their prices went up, they were taking their reasonable customary profit and passing that, cost on to the customer. And that, so it was very much more limited in scope. That's what we endorsed earlier. Again, hers is much broader, and it would get into the things that we expect will come up in any legislative debate. So again, I think the Michigan Propane Gas Association kind of rightly points out that it supports this general concept, but the actual language matters.
Yep, that's a really good overview. Any thoughts on 14? Does anybody disagree with that approach? We tried to be nuanced in how we drafted it, so. Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
this is Douglas Jester. I'm a little concerned that failure to respond in some way to the Attorney General's recommendation would then be read as opposition to SB 848. And I don't want us to be taking a position in opposition to it either. So I'm wondering if we could modify recommendation 14 so it could be such as SB 848 or using the Wisconsin law as a potential model.
Or you drop both, you just put a period after legislation.
Right.
Yeah, I would be cautious about this body getting engaged in legislation.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly would be advocating for the task force to be viewed as for or against. And so I think that, I think as long as we're not explicitly calling it out, I don't think anyone would read this as being in opposition to what's already out there. I don't know.
Then perhaps James's suggestion of just a period in place of the comma after legislation.
I actually like the way it's written. This is Mike Nystrom. I like the way that it's written. I think having consistency, we know that we have a situation where there are wholesalers that sell in both places. If they understand that we're shooting for consistency in our laws, to keep an eye on our costing, I like the way that it's written. I agree with Liesl that we start getting into legislation and the whims of the AG on every single one of our recommendations. We might as well have just had the AG do this, and why have a commission or why have a task force?
Other thoughts? Yep.
I tend to agree with the way that it's written because I think it gets to what we are trying to do here. And so I don't necessarily oppose sort of trying to clarify that in terms of what is the Wisconsin law that is the potential model. And I think Mike's point that it sort of gets to not just retailers, but wholesalers as well might be, if we wanted to clarify. I think it is dangerous I think we should talk about what we want to see, but I think it's dangerous to, in a report, sort of support or oppose specific pieces of already introduced legislation. And if the sponsors want to argue that that Senate Bill 848 falls within recommendation 14, I think they can. If those who would support a more limited approach want to say that it goes further than that, I think. But we should say what it is that we're actually after, and that is, I think, price gouging legislation that doesn't stop at just the retail providers, but also can address sort of price gouging at the wholesale level as well.
So why don't we do a period after legislation and then add a sentence or two that describes that legislation? Does that sound right?
I think that would be fine. I just don't want to put a period after legislation because we do have price gouging legislation. It just stops at the retail level.
That's
Mike,
why
what do you think about that?
That's why I think the way that it's done already is good. We do want to follow what Michigan or what Wisconsin put in place. We talked about it at length. I think that what's gotten confused here is I haven't heard anyone be opposed to what we talked about Wisconsin. I think the challenge is talking about what the AG suggested here, and I just don't think we should jump into that fray. I think what we have there is perfect.
So,
yeah,
Mike,
this is Chris. I totally agree. I think it's perfect the way it is, and I don't think it should be changed.
So Mike and Chris, you feel like saying Wisconsin law as a potential model needs to be the language that's in there. What if we added a sentence or two that described what the statute does, as opposed to specifically calling out the Wisconsin law, so we don't get into the position of the task force potentially being seen as supporting or opposing legislation?
The narrative portion just above it is kind of a couple of sentences that is descriptive to the Wisconsin law.
Could we pull some of that narrative down into the recommendation, I'm open.
I think it goes back to the earlier conversation we had, Liesl, that the recommendations should be relatively generic. We're saying using it as a potential model. I think those two words, it's a potential model. We aren't using it as gospel. It doesn't have to be exactly the way that it is, but the narrative above gives a little more detail.
Yeah, sure does.
Yeah, this is Mike Percy weighing in. I think it should probably just be as it's written as a potential model. Anybody that has an interest in this, should someone introduce a bill that goes into the meat of what we're talking about here, the Propane Gas Association, the Attorney General, all of the MPSC, everybody's going to have an opportunity to come and testify at the committee hearings if and when a bill is ever taken up. So the less we nitpick it at this point, the better. I think if we just say, this is what we think you should be looking at, and then allow the legislature, their staff, and the interested parties to weigh in, probably makes more sense, at least to me.
Okay. All right, looping back to Douglas as the starting point. Douglas, are you all right if we leave it as is?
Reluctantly, I am still concerned that we're implicitly taking a position on the Attorney General's bill. Just didn't want to do that.
Okay.
This is Roman. I like Liesl's idea of just providing a 2-sentence summation of what we think the model should be, and staying away from referring to a specific state or yeah, I don't think it's a good idea.
Well, folks, we got all the way to the last one until we ended up in a position where I'm trying to figure out how to Shoot it down the middle. Let's see, I'm looking at the prior language.
The two parts that reflect what we like about Wisconsin, and they're in the narrative, we could say adopting fuel price gouging legislation. I guess you could put a period, potential model should be one which applies to both wholesale and retail, and ensures that the prices charged to customers reflect the actual costs incurred by the propane provider plus a reasonable and customary profit, period. So really, it's just taking bits of both of those sentences and putting it below.
This is Douglas, that would certainly work for me.
I second that. This is Roman.
Mike, Chris, does that feel reasonable, or does that still feel like it's not going to get where you guys want to get?
I guess go ahead and put it in there. I was arguing for what we had was fine. Again, I firmly believe that, like the fine senator just said, we've had this conversation before. We are not going to write these recommendations and the legislature is going to go, hey, gee, let's put it all together exactly the way they said it. This isn't going to look anything like the legislation. So whatever we put in here is going to be a fine recommendation. It's never going to come to fruition as a public act anytime in the near future. It's a recommendation. We all have to remember that.
I think the argument that's being made is that there's already legislation that's out there. And so the way that our recommendations crafted, it could be seen as taking a position on legislation that's out there. So I think that's more the reason for the
Let's put it together and take a look at it then.
Okay.
Can James read it again real quick?
Yes, please.
I didn't write it down, but I'll try it again here. Let's see. The legislature should explore adopting fuel price gouging legislation, period. But then it would have a new sentence that says, a potential model would be one that would apply to both the wholesale and retailers of propane. And then you just pick up the end of the very last sentence of the narrative and ensures that the prices charged to customers reflect the actual cost incurred by propane providers plus a reasonable and customary profit.
Would it be possible? So I'm thinking it might be worthwhile to have that typed up and let us look at it. And we have to loop back to recommendation 5 and recommendation 8. But I also know that we're doing all of it at once.
I think we fixed 8.
Okay.
I've sent you a version of 5 if you want to go to that, and I'll clean this one up.
Okay. All right, so let's loop back to 5. Kimber, do you want me to? I don't know how. Kimber, it's in email. I think if you go pull it from email, you can paste it into the document, recommendation 5.
I will do that.
Great. I'll take us back to there. Thanks for everybody's patience. It always takes a little bit to get everything to pop up on the screen.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Is it 4?
5.
Okay.
I think you're in the right spot. There we go. Okay. So the railroad companies should review ratings classifications of their respective rail lines as it pertains to the ability to handle propane delivered by rail. In addition, railroad companies should inventory their spur lines for potential use for short-term parking of propane car during an emergency. The Michigan Department of Transportation should survey rail companies regarding the current state of their systems and forward recommendations to the Michigan legislature about any needed rail line upgrades to facilitate propane distribution. I thought we were striking the parking language.
The question just becomes is, in my head was, well, why do you care about spur lines if you're not at least doing short-term parking? That's the only reason you would inventory your spur lines.
Okay. Oh, and Aaron's offered some language in the chat box as well. So Aaron offers MDOT should facilitate a survey through which railroad companies would review their respective ownership and provide ratings classifications of their lines and spurs and needed upgrades to facilitate improved propane distribution in the UP. MDOT, in collaboration with the railroad companies, should provide a summary of the survey results and recommendations regarding needed rail line upgrades to the Michigan legislature. I guess I would be inclined to say if the task force, I think, needs to feel comfortable with if the parking language is in there, and then I would offer that between Eagle and MDOT, we can figure out how to get the recommendation to the agencies correct. But I certainly wouldn't want to, and then we can have that out over the next day or two, but I certainly wouldn't want to leave the meat of the conversation, leave this discussion without the meat of the conversation everybody being comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, I like the Aaron's language, a lot of good stuff there.
So I guess my question to the task force is, are you comfortable with the short-term parking language in there because that's why we're doing the spur line inventory? And then if so, are you then comfortable with MDOT and Eagle working out how to direct the agencies to do the survey itself?
This is Tanya. I think that makes sense and agree that the concept of the parking was sort of a lot of the driver behind looking at the spur line. So to have something in there that acknowledges the cars may be moved around but need to sit in certain places based on need makes sense.
But then we wouldn't be making a recommendation about what to do. We would just be collecting the data.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tanya, on that. It's not going to hurt to inventory the parking. You may need it, but it's just not a real solid approach to increasing your volume, I don't think. If I understand the meaning of spur rail. It's just like a parking spot for parking stuff. It's not like a connection between Rapid River and Escanaba. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe that's correct, Dave. We're just collecting the data and making it available.
Okay.
Okay, so is everyone comfortable with the survey recommendation of recommendation 5, and then we'll work out the language, knowing that we've got, the next couple of days, we'll get some language back to you. All right, I take your silence as you're comfortable. Let's skip forward to 8. We think, so James, were you saying you think 8's good?
I thought we had resolved 8 before we left.
All right, and then it's back to 14.
And I sent
Sorry to make you skip around, Kimber.
I sent her one sentence to tag on to what she had there, which was kind of what we had said, but
Let's try 14 again. Thanks for everybody's patience as we work through teams.
James, would this just go in place of what I wrote there already?
I would add it to yours, but I'm not seeing yours yet, so we're still getting down
It
there,
says,
so.
it was just
Yeah.
your words of a potential model would be one that would apply.
Yeah,
to
so
both.
just add the sentence I sent you to the end.
No, okay.
Okay, so where we're going with 14. The legislature should explore adopting fuel price gouging legislation using the Wisconsin law as a potential model. A potential model would be one that would apply to both wholesalers and retailers of propane.
Again, and then I'm just grabbing the sentence of the above narrative, I think is what she's trying to put in other.
There it is. The legislation would ensure that the prices charged to customers reflect the actual costs incurred by propane providers plus a reasonable customary profit.
So then the question becomes, do you even need the reference to Wisconsin anymore if you've put all that stuff in there?
How are folks feeling?
I'm okay with the changes. It's generic enough for me.
Great, thanks, Mike Brucey.
I think you just leave it as is, but I don't think you have to say a potential model again right in a row. You can say this could be one or something along that line. You know, just change it so it doesn't say potential model in a row.
Okay, we can fix that. Good flag, good flag.
And I'm okay. This is Douglas. Said we've now conveyed the essential characteristics of such a law. I mean,
okay.
We can be silent on other aspects of it.
Anybody else on the language for 14 revised?
Yeah, this is Chris. I think it sounds good.
Great, thanks, Chris. Anyone else?
This is Roman. Looks good to me.
Great. All right, hopefully we've captured all the concerns. Okay. Anybody want to revisit any of the recommendations that we just talked about? All right, then with the task force permission, what we're going to do at Eagle is we're going to clean up what we heard here today. We did our best to capture it in real time in the document in front of you. And then we're going to get it back out to you again with intended delivery to the governor at the end of the week. And with that, we're going to switch over to public comments. Before we do that, I just want to say again how grateful I am to all the members of the task force. You know, this was one small step of all the work that we've been doing together, and I really appreciate all that you have been doing. Before we go to public comment, and I'm really looking forward to hearing public input on phase 2 of the task force and what the types of discussion points you all are hoping will bring up. But for the task force specifically, our next meeting is May 12th. It will be, again, a meeting in a virtual environment, and we are planning presentations that are going to start building a grounding for all of us in the more robust energy perspective of the Upper Peninsula. So talking about the differences in the electricity supply in the Upper Peninsula, different providers, you know, industrial owned utilities as well, or excuse me, investor owned utilities as well as co-ops and municipals, talk about transmission distribution, talk about the unique landscape that is the Upper Peninsula. So that's the intended presentations for the 12th. I'm also not anticipating that that's going to be 8 hours, because 8 hours of virtual presentation sounds very painful. So we'll come up with something and that we'll do our best to keep you all engaged and engrossed and involved in the conversation, but it'll probably be more like 2 to 3, 3 to 4 hours. We'll try to set it up in a way that creates a lot of opportunity for input. So with that, any other comments from task force members on their recommendations?
This is Douglas Chester. I'd like to thank you and your staff for the work of putting the draft together. It was very helpful in getting us to a conclusion.
Great. Thanks, Douglas. Okay, and with that, we're going to switch over to public comment. So for those of you that have joined us, thank you. We've had close to 100 people participate in this discussion. We very much appreciate it. As with all of our other task force meetings, we've done everything in a very transparent way. So if this is your first meeting, please feel free to go back to the michigan.gov/UP Energy Task Force to see all of our previous work. We're very interested in hearing from all of you. So I'm going to ask you to either put something in the chat room if you want to speak, or send an email to the email address, which is eagle-upenergy@michigan.gov. To let us know that you want to speak. And again, we're interested in all comments, but particularly interested in helping us think about what you think the task force should be considering for phase 2. And just as a reminder, before I go and see what we've got, we're over 1,000 comments to date. We've received over 950 written comments to our email address, and around 800 of those were on the draft recommendations. We very much appreciate it. And we've received a total of 42 snail mail comments, which is great. And then close to 60 participants in our verbal comments in our task force meetings. So we think it's a really important component of the work that we're all doing. So with that, Kimber, do you have anybody that has emailed you that would like to give public comment?
I do not have any emails as of right now requesting public comment. I see like a public comment written into the chat.
I do too. So I'll read this from Don Steckman. Unless Don, would you like to unmute yourself and read it to us? Okay, I'll go ahead and read it, and then we can, I'm sorry, I also missed the part where everything that was received in email or in written form has been conveyed to the members of the task force as well. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that that's all getting shared. So Don says, although some of the task force recommendations have merit and if adopted could have a positive effect on the propane supply in the UP, they are all very long-term suggestions and would take at a minimum several years to implement. Even a combination of those recommendations would not negate our need for line 5. Based on that, the recommendation I don't see is the importance and need that the task force has proven for Rapid River and Line 5 to supply propane through the UP. This seems to be the elephant in the room, but the facts show Line 5 cannot be shut down anytime in the near future without negatively affecting the ability to get propane into the UP as part of this report. Okay, thank you, Don. Okay, we have Calvin Hartwig. Oh, Don says he tried to unmute and couldn't. Thank you, Don. All right, Calvin Hartwig would like to give comment. I should have said at the outset too, our structure for verbal public comment has been to hold it to 3 minutes. You're certainly welcome to give us everything you want to give us in written, but we'll hold it to 3 minutes for the purposes of our presentation here. So Calvin, if you would like to unmute, and I'll go ahead and start the timer and you can have 3 minutes.
Great, thanks, Liesl. So my name is Calvin Hartwig. I work with We the People Michigan, and I have concern that holding the task force meetings before the COVID-19 crisis is fully mitigated will limit the ability for meaningful public comment. And I know some of the past task force meetings had some really robust in-person public comment. So I hope that we can postpone meetings until we can have that extra input. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Calvin. Kimber, do you have other emails for public comment? Or Kimber's probably getting off mute. I don't see anything else in the chat. So if we don't have any other emails,
Okay, I'm gonna check real quick. I just have to flip over to email a second.
thank you. And again, I would like to remind folks, we are very interested in public comment and have received a lot through our website, through the email, eagle, E-G-L-E dash upenergy@michigan.gov. So close to 1,000 comments there. And then, you know, always happy to receive things in other formats as well. So, Kimber,
I do not have any emails requesting public comments.
Okay, great. I'm going to go back and make sure that we have talked about everything we need to talk about. I'm going to remind everybody that the recordings, presentations, agendas, minutes, etc., are all on the website as well. Great. Wow. I think we may have come in 3 minutes right from the deadline. Oh, there's another recommendation, public comment in the chat box. So we'll review that and submit that to the task force as well. Anything else? All right, with that, task force members, thanks again for all your hard work. Look for an email from us. And certainly, you know, look for us to be cleaning up typos and all that sort of things to the report too. And we'll look forward to a end of the week delivery. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Huge thank you to Kimber, James, Brandy, and others on the Eagle team. And we'll look forward to talking to everybody again May 12th, if not before. Stay safe. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.